I arrived 40 minutes late to my son's Thanksgiving dinner, and the moment I stepped into that shining room, I knew I didn't belong. The chandelier light hit the grease stains on my coat like spotlights on failure. My boots squeaked on the polished hardwood floor. Conversations froze mid-sentence, and every eye turned toward me. Samantha, my daughter-in-law, stood near the table in a gold dress that shimmered under the light. She looked me up and down as if I were a stray dog that had wandered in from the street. "You should have stayed home, Henry," she said coolly. "This isn't really your place tonight." A few people laughed softly, trying to make it sound polite. My son Mark, sitting halfway down the long table, just said, "Dad, please," and looked away. The sound of forks and glasses filled the silence again. I sat down quietly at the edge of the table, my chair slightly out of line with the others. The smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon pie wrapped the room in warmth I couldn't feel. My hands, still stained with grease, rested on my lap. I looked down and told myself to breathe. I was here finally, even if nobody wanted me to be. The Benton residence looked like a museum: crystal glasses, silver utensils, paintings that probably cost more than my car. Samantha's parents, Harold and Patricia, sat at the head of the table like royalty. The whole family carried the same polished confidence that comes with old money. Their laughter was smooth, their smiles rehearsed. I tried to smile back, though my reflection in the glass window behind them looked completely out of place, gray hair still damp from the rain, hands rough, suit slightly wrinkled. Harold looked down the table, pretending to sound friendly. "Rough drive, Henry. I heard traffic was bad." I gave a short nod. "The roads were slick," I said. "I stopped to help someone whose car broke down." Samantha gave a soft, exaggerated laugh. "Always the hero, huh?" I felt the words sink in, but didn't say anything. Instead, I reached for my glass of water and took a slow sip, pretending it didn't sting. I'd been to this house only twice before, once when Mark and Samantha first got engaged, and again for their son's baptism. Both times I felt like an extra in someone else's story. Tonight wasn't any different. Samantha moved through the room like a hostess on television, refilling wine glasses, complimenting guests, never missing a beat. Mark looked tired, his eyes darting between me and her father, silently praying no one would say the wrong thing. Around me, conversations picked up again. People talked about new real estate investments, vacations in Italy, stock dividends. I nodded politely, though I understood maybe half of what they were saying. Someone mentioned a partnership deal between Benton Construction and Warren Industries. Something about renewable energy expansion. Everyone seemed impressed. I just kept my eyes on my plate, cutting my turkey into tiny pieces. Every so often I caught Samantha glancing at me, her lips tight in a smile that never reached her eyes. I wondered if she was embarrassed by how I looked. Probably. My coat was still damp and my shoes left faint marks on the rug. I thought about taking them off by the door, but that would have looked worse. When I was younger, Thanksgiving meant warmth. My wife Linda humming in the kitchen, the smell of apple pie and coffee. Mark laughing as we tried to carve the turkey without ruining it. Back then, nobody cared what kind of car you drove or whether your suit matched your shoes. Back then, we were just family. I could feel the sting of nostalgia rising, but I pushed it down. Tonight wasn't about the past. It was about trying one more time to be part of Mark's world. Harold spoke again, his tone casual but sharp enough to cut. "You know, Henry, most people your age would have called a tow truck. You really shouldn't trouble yourself in weather like this." I smiled faintly. "Old habits die hard. I've spent a lifetime fixing engines, sir. Can't drive past a broken one." That drew a few polite laughs, though I couldn't tell if they were laughing with me or at me. Probably the latter. Samantha leaned toward Mark and whispered something. I didn't catch it, but whatever it was made him shift uncomfortably. I looked at my son, and felt something heavy settle in my chest. He wasn't cruel. He just didn't know how to bridge the space between his father and his new life. I couldn't even blame him. Maybe if I'd had more to offer than stories and oil-stained hands, things would have been different. The server came around with another bottle of wine, and someone asked me if I wanted any. I shook my head. No, thank you. I'm driving. The man nodded quickly, as if relieved not to have to pour for me. The rest of the table broke into laughter at a joke Harold told about contractors, and I smiled automatically, though I hadn't heard the setup. My chest felt tight. I stared at the flickering candles, letting their light blur into shapes. I reached into my pocket and touched the small business card I'd been given earlier that evening. Smooth, embossed letters I hadn't even had time to read properly. I wasn't sure why I kept it, maybe because it reminded me that the world outside this room still had decent people in it. Samantha's voice broke through my thoughts. Dad, maybe we should start the toast. Harold lifted his glass. To family, he said, and to opportunities worth taking. Glasses clinked. I raised my water, though no one noticed. When the toast ended, Mark turned to me, his voice low. Dad, you could have told me you'd be late. I didn't know, I said softly. The storm was worse than I thought. He sighed. Samantha just wants everything to go smoothly tonight. There's a lot riding on this dinner. I nodded, understanding what he couldn't say aloud. I was the thing that could ruin it. The laughter around us grew louder again. Samantha's parents were entertaining their business guests, now discussing expansions and mergers. I heard the word Warren again, but I didn't pay attention. I stared at the reflection in my glass, my lined face, my tired eyes, and wondered when I'd started feeling like a guest in my own family. I picked up my fork, forcing myself to eat, though every bite tasted the same, like nothing. If you're watching this, maybe you're wondering why an old man like me would put himself through that kind of humiliation. Why I didn't just stay home, eat leftovers, and call it a night. Well, let me take you back an hour before this dinner, back to a freezing road outside Portland where one small act of kindness turned out to change everything. The mornings in Portland always start the same for me, quiet, gray, and slow. The coffee pot sputters like an old friend waking up reluctantly, and the radio hums in the background, reporting on weather and politics I no longer care much about. My apartment is small but clean. The wallpaper is faded, the floor creaks, and the heater rattles every time it kicks on. Still, it's home. On the wall above the kitchen table hangs a photograph from 25 years ago, me, my late wife Linda, and a boy with a toothy grin holding a toy wrench. Mark couldn't have been more than 10. I sip my coffee and watch the light crawl through the blinds, soft and pale. Some mornings the silence feels heavier than the air itself. You start thinking about the years that slipped away while you were busy surviving them. I open the paper, read the headlines, then fold it neatly without remembering a single word. Old habits. My routine keeps me steady. Shower, coffee, short walk to the corner store. Maybe stop by my friend Tom's garage to lend a hand. Tom's garage isn't what it used to be. The building smells like oil and nostalgia, and most of the customers these days are folks who still drive cars old enough to need fixing by hand. I don't get paid, and I don't want to. I go there to stay busy, to hear the sound of wrenches clinking instead of the echo of my own thoughts. Tom jokes that I can't retire because I'd go crazy doing nothing. Maybe he's right. My neighbor Martha knocks on my door around noon most days. She's 72, widowed, kind, and nosy in the best way. She brings over banana bread or leftover dumplings, always wrapped carefully in foil. "You keeping out of trouble, Henry?" she asks every time. Trying my best, I always answer. She smiles knowingly, like she can see right through the loneliness I try to hide. "Don't let that coffee be your only company," she says. I laugh. "You sound like Linda. Well, she says, tapping my arm sounds like she was a smart woman. She's right about that. After she leaves, the apartment feels even quieter. I sit in my chair by the window, the same one Linda used to read in. I can almost hear her humming, sometimes soft and low, like a ghost refusing to leave. 6 years she's been gone, and some days it still feels fresh. When she passed, Mark was just starting his life with Samantha. They were busy climbing careers, saving for a house. I didn't want to be a burden, so I told him I was fine. That's what fathers do, pretend we're fine so our kids don't worry. But the truth is, since Linda died, I've been walking through life like a man who misplaced something important. I just can't remember where I left it. Mark calls once every week or two. Our conversations are short, polite, and careful. Like we're both afraid of saying the wrong thing. Hey, Dad, how's everything? Same old? How's work? Busy? That's usually it. He always sounds distracted, and I never want to keep him. Samantha rarely gets on the line. When she does, her voice is polite but distant, like she's talking to a client instead of her husband's father. I don't blame her. She comes from a world of handshakes and tailored suits, while I come from one where grease under your nails means you worked hard. I remember the first time I met her parents. It was at her birthday dinner. They greeted me with smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes, and Samantha introduced me as Mark's dad. He's a mechanic. Not Henry. Just a title, a label that fit neatly into her world. I brought a gift I'd made myself, a wooden clock carved in the shape of a gear. I remember her saying, "Oh, how rustic," before setting it aside. That was the moment I knew I was welcome in name only. But Mark looked happy, and that was enough for me. Or so I told myself. One afternoon last week, I got a card in the mail, heavy paper, gold lettering, definitely not from my circle of life. The envelope said, "The Benton Family Thanksgiving Dinner, 5 p.m., Bellevue." At the bottom in Mark's handwriting, "Dad, hope you can make it this year." I stared at it for a long time. The Bentons had never invited me personally before. Usually Mark would say something like, "They're keeping it small this year," or "We'll visit you another time." I didn't ask questions. But now, suddenly, they wanted me there. Maybe it was Samantha's idea. Maybe she was trying to make peace. I called Mark that evening. So I said, "You're sure they want me to come?" He hesitated, just a beat too long. "Of course. They said it wouldn't feel right without family." "Family," I repeated. "That's nice of them." "Yeah," he said quickly. "Just maybe wear something formal. You know how Dad-in-law is about appearances. I'll do my best." After we hung up, I sat staring at the phone. His tone reminded me of how he used to sound as a boy when he'd broken something, half nervous, half hopeful that I wouldn't be mad. Only now he was afraid I'd embarrass him. That night, I pulled my old Navy suit out of the closet. Linda had bought it for me 15 years ago for a friend's wedding. I brushed the dust off and hung it by the window. It still fit more or less. I polished my shoes and laid them beside the door. For the first time in a long time, I wanted to make a good impression. The next morning, Martha stopped by with a pumpkin pie wrapped in foil. "Big dinner tonight?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. "Thanksgiving with my son's in-laws." She smiled knowingly. "Nervous?" "Maybe a little," I admitted. She squeezed my hand. "Just be yourself, Henry. People notice good hearts eventually." After she left, I stood at the window watching the first flakes of snow fall. The radio warned about an incoming storm, but I didn't care. I'd drive slow. I wasn't going to miss this chance. I spent the rest of the day pacing the apartment, straightening my tie, checking the time. The apartment felt smaller the more I waited. When the clock hit 1:30, I grabbed my coat, locked the door, and stepped into the cold. My breath formed clouds in the air. As I walked to my truck, I thought of Linda. She would have told me to stop worrying, to remember that good people don't need fancy suits to be worth something. I smiled at the thought and started the engine. It coughed twice before roaring to life. The wipers squeaked against the windshield as I pulled out onto the street. The world outside was wrapped in gray clouds and swirling snow. But beneath all that, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: hope. I didn't know that the road I was taking that afternoon wouldn't just lead to a family dinner. It would lead to a man stranded in the storm, a small act of kindness, and a night that would change my life forever. I woke up before the alarm, the pale light of a cold Oregon morning filtering through my curtains. The air smelled like rain and burnt coffee. Today was Thanksgiving, and for the first time in years, I actually had somewhere to be. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, buttoning my shirt, trying to ignore the deep lines around my eyes. 67 years had a way of showing up on your face, no matter how steady you tried to stand. I laid everything out the night before: the navy suit, freshly pressed the old tie Linda once called my good luck charm, and the small pumpkin pie Martha baked for me. On the counter sat a bottle of cheap red wine I'd bought at the corner store. It wasn't fancy, but it was something. I wanted to bring a gift that said, "I'm thankful to be invited," not "I'm trying too hard." The radio played quietly as I poured myself a cup of coffee. "Winter storm warning," the announcer said, cheerful as ever. Snow expected across western Oregon this afternoon. I looked out the window. The sky was already the color of steel. I didn't mind the weather. I'd driven through worse. I just hoped I'd make it there without any problems. Martha knocked on my door around 9. She was holding a small bag. "Homemade cranberry sauce," she said. "Take it. It'll make you look like the kind of man who remembers details." I laughed. "You sure you're not trying to marry me off to someone?" She grinned. "If I find a lady who likes men who fix cars and still say please and thank you, I'll let you know." We sat for a minute, sharing coffee and quiet. "You nervous?" she asked finally. "Yeah," I admitted. "Haven't been to a big family dinner since Linda passed. Feels like stepping into someone else's life." Martha squeezed my hand. "You raised a good man, Henry. Don't forget that. Just be yourself. The rest isn't up to you." After she left, I cleaned the apartment one last time, habit I guess, and sat by the window watching snowflakes drift down like slow confetti. I thought about Mark's call the day before, how his voice carried that same careful tone I'd learned to recognize pride mixed with discomfort. He wanted me there, but he also wanted me not to cause trouble. Around noon, my phone rang again. "Dad, Mark said, just checking you're still coming." "I'm on schedule," I said. "Good. Just remember they're a little formal. And Samantha's dad, he's very particular, I remember." "Oh, and Dad," he added, quieter now, "please don't feel bad if it's awkward. It'll mean a lot that you came." I wanted to tell him that no matter what happened, I wasn't there to win anyone's approval. But that wasn't true, not entirely. I wanted him to be proud to call me his father again. I just said, "I'll be fine, son. Drive safe, all right." When the call ended, I stood by the coat rack, running my fingers over the fabric of my old winter coat. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm, and that was what mattered. I tucked Martha's cranberry sauce into a paper bag, along with the pie and wine. Before locking the door, I looked around my apartment one last time, as if I were leaving behind something more than walls. The drive started easy enough. The old truck groaned a little as it warmed up, but once we hit the highway, it hummed steadily beneath me. Snow flurries danced across the windshield, melting as they landed. The road stretched long and quiet, the kind of peaceful silence that reminds you how small you are compared to the world. I passed a frozen field where kids used to play soccer in the summers. It made me think of the year Mark turned 10. I'd promised him we'd build a go-kart together for the school derby. We spent 2 weeks in the garage, late nights, covered in sawdust and paint. The thing barely held together, but it crossed the finish line. Linda took a picture of us that day, both of us grinning faces smeared with grease. I still have it framed in my hallway. Funny how the years pile up without you noticing. One day you're teaching your kid how to steer. The next, he's asking you to dress formal so you don't embarrass him in front of his wife's family. The snow started to pick up near Salem. I turned down the radio and focused on the road. Cars ahead of me moved slower now, their brake lights glowing red through the fog. I tightened my grip on the wheel and leaned forward, squinting through the flakes. Halfway through the drive, I pulled into a gas station to top off the tank and stretch my legs. The clerk wished me a happy Thanksgiving, and I wished him the same. Back on the highway, traffic had thinned out. It was just me, the storm, and the steady rhythm of the windshield wipers. As I drove, I thought about what I'd say if someone asked me about my life. The truth was simple. I'd worked hard, loved, deeply lost, quietly. I'd done what men of my generation were taught to do. Keep moving, keep fixing, keep providing. And yet somehow, I'd still ended up alone in a small apartment, talking to a picture frame more than to people. The road curved along the Columbia River, gray water glistening under the stormy sky. I turned the heat up and cracked the window just a little. The cold air helped me stay awake. I imagined what the dinner would be like. The laughter, the fancy dishes, the way Samantha's family would talk about things like stocks and real estate while pretending not to notice my calloused hands. I knew the kind of people. They were nice enough on the surface, but careful about who they let too close. Still, I hoped maybe this year would be different. Maybe they'd see that I wasn't some relic from another life. Maybe they'd see I was just a man trying to belong somewhere again. By the time I reached the outskirts of Bellevue, the storm had grown worse. Snowflakes turned to sleet, slapping against the windshield. The wipers squealed in protest. I slowed down, squinting through the blur of headlights and ice. My hands ached from gripping the wheel. The GPS said I was 20 minutes away from the Benton residence. I told myself I'd be fine. Just keep driving, get there safe, don't make Mark worry. But as the highway curved around a wooded stretch, I saw something ahead, hazard lights blinking faintly through the snow. A black luxury sedan was parked on the shoulder, steam rising from its hood. Someone stood beside it, waving an arm. I glanced at the clock, 4:20 p.m. The dinner started at 5. I could have kept driving, most people would have. But something in me wouldn't let me. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was Linda's voice echoing in my head. If you see someone stranded, you stop. Doesn't matter who they are. I sighed, turned on my blinker and pulled over behind the car. That decision, small, simple, almost automatic, was about to change everything. The snow was coming down hard when I pulled onto the shoulder, my wipers struggling to keep up. The black sedan ahead looked expensive, one of those cars that practically shines even under a layer of ice. Its hazard lights blinked steadily, casting orange flashes onto the snow-covered road. A man stood beside it, his gray coat whipping in the wind, one gloved hand shielding his face from the sleet. I rolled down my window a few inches. "You need a hand," I called out. The man turned toward me. He looked to be in his early 60s, tall with sharp eyes that missed nothing. His hair was silver, his posture straight despite the cold. He gave a polite, slightly embarrassed nod. "Battery's dead, I think. Called for roadside assistance, but they said at least an hour. Maybe 2. "Pop the hood," I said. "Let's take a look." He hesitated. "You sure it's freezing out?" I smiled. I've worked in worse. I parked behind him, flipped on my hazards, and climbed out. The wind hit me like a wall, slicing through my coat. Snow crunched under my boots as I walked over. When he lifted the hood, a puff of white steam rose, mixing with the snowflakes. The engine bay was spotless, but the battery terminals were crusted with white corrosion. "There's your problem," I said, tapping the terminal with my gloved finger. "Looks like corrosion buildup." He frowned. And that means your car's not getting power to start. Easy fix if you have a little soda. He blinked. Soda Coca-Cola, I said. It'll eat through the rust. Trick I learned about 40 years ago. The man gave me a look halfway between disbelief and amusement. You're kidding. Not at all. You got any in the car? He looked at his leather interior, pristine and untouched. Then reluctantly, he reached inside and came back with a glass bottle from a cooler in the back seat. Don't ask why I had this. I won't, I said, taking it from him. I twisted off the cap, poured the Coke over the terminals, and watched it fizz. There we go, I murmured. The liquid hissed as it worked, loosening the crusted residue. I dug into my pocket for my keys and used the edge of one to scrape away the buildup. You're ruining your hands, he said. Already ruined them years ago, I replied, smiling. This is just maintenance. He chuckled softly, his breath visible in the cold air. For a moment we worked in silence, the sound of the snow against metal, the faint hiss of the soda, the hum of passing cars. After a few minutes, I said, "Try it now." He climbed behind the wheel, turned the key, and the engine roared to life immediately. The look on his face shifted from surprise to relief. He stepped out and extended his hand. "That's incredible. You just fixed it with a bottle of Coke." I wiped my hands on my coat. Sometimes the simplest things work best. "You saved me from waiting out here all night," he said. "I owe you." I shook my head. "No one owes me anything. Just glad you're safe." The man studied me for a moment. "Where were you headed?" "Family dinner," I said. "My son's in-laws' place up in Bellevue." He raised an eyebrow. "In this weather, yeah. Big Thanksgiving gathering. Haven't been invited in years. Figured I shouldn't miss it." He smiled faintly. "That sounds important." "It is," I said. "Though I might be showing up late." He nodded thoughtfully. "Most people wouldn't have stopped, especially dressed like you are." "Would have bothered me more to drive past," I said simply. He looked at me like he was trying to memorize my face. Then he reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a sleek silver business card, and handed it to me. "If you ever need anything, call this number. My name's Ethan Warren." I looked at the card. The embossed letters gleamed even in the dim light. Ethan Warren. Warren Industries. I frowned slightly. The name sounded familiar. "You in construction?" He smiled. "Something like that. We build things, but not always what people expect." I slipped the card into my pocket. "Well, Mr. Warren, good luck with your dinner or wherever you're headed." He hesitated. "You sure you won't let me buy you dinner sometime? Or at least a proper cup of coffee? Just get home safe," I said. "That's enough for me." He laughed, then nodded respectfully. "Then thank you, Mr. Lawson," I said. "Henry Lawson." He repeated the name like he was filing it away for later. "I won't forget that." I waved, turned back toward my truck, and climbed inside. My fingers were stiff from the cold, my clothes soaked through. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw him still standing by his car, watching as I pulled back onto the road. The snow blurred everything behind me, until he was just a gray silhouette against the white. I drove slowly, heat blasting from the vents. The dashboard clock read 5:40 p.m. I was definitely going to be late. Samantha would hate that. I imagined the look on her face, the way she'd whisper something sharp to Mark under her breath. But as I drove, I couldn't stop thinking about the man I'd just met. His calm, deliberate way of speaking, the steadiness in his eyes. It wasn't what I expected from someone that wealthy. There was something familiar about him, though I couldn't place it. Maybe it was the way he said my name, like he'd known it before. The storm grew worse as I neared Bellevue. Wind howled across the windshield, and every curve of the road shimmered with ice. Still, I felt strangely peaceful. My hands might have been numb, my clothes damp, but something about helping that man, Something about being useful again warmed me more than the truck's heater ever could. I thought about Linda and the hundreds of times she'd told me, "Good deeds don't need witnesses, Henry. They have a way of circling back." I smiled faintly at the memory. Maybe she was right. Maybe kindness didn't disappear after all. As the lights of the Benton neighborhood finally appeared in the distance, I reached into my coat pocket and touched Ethan Warren's card. The silver edges were cold against my fingers. I didn't know why I kept it there. Maybe because it felt like more than just a piece of paper, like a reminder that there were still decent people in the world, even in the middle of a storm. By the time I turned into the long tree-lined driveway of the Benton estate, the snow had slowed to a light drift. I caught sight of myself in the rearview mirror, hair a mess collar, wet jacket stained with grease. My reflection looked nothing like the man I'd wanted to be tonight. I let out a breath and whispered, "Well, here we go." I parked at the end of the driveway and stepped out into the cold. The house glowed ahead, bright and warm, like something out of a movie. I brushed the snow from my sleeves and straightened my tie. The pie was still on the passenger seat, slightly dented but intact. I picked it up, squared my shoulders, and walked toward the front door. I didn't know it yet, but the man I'd just helped, the one with the calm voice and silver eyes, was about to walk into the same house behind me. And before the night was over, he would turn everything upside down. By the time I parked in front of the Benton house, the snow had turned to slush. The driveway glistened under the golden lights that outlined the 3-story mansion like something out of a magazine. Through the windows, I could see people moving around, their glasses raise their laughter muffled by the walls. I caught my reflection in the truck's side mirror, hair wind-blown tie, crooked grease on my collar, and the faint smell of motor oil still clinging to my hands. Not exactly the picture of refinement. I grabbed the pumpkin pie from the seat, took a deep breath, and walked up the steps. When I pressed the doorbell, the sound echoed like a challenge. The door swung open, and Samantha appeared. Her dress shimmered gold under the chandelier behind her. For a split second, her smile seemed genuine, until her eyes dropped to the oil stains on my coat. "Oh my God," she said softly, but not softly enough. "What happened to you?" "Got caught in the storm," I said. "Helped a man whose car broke down on the interstate." Her eyebrows shot up. "You stopped in this weather?" I nodded. "Couldn't just drive past him." Her lips tightened. "That's admirable, I guess. But Dad's clients are here. Maybe you should, clean up first." Before I could answer, Mark appeared behind her, his face tight with worry. "Dad," he said gently, "why don't you use the downstairs bathroom? I'll show you." I could see the strain in his eyes, the push and pull between loyalty and embarrassment. "Sure," I said quietly. "Just give me a second." Samantha stepped aside, her perfume sweet and sharp in the air. I caught sight of the dining room behind her, an ocean of polished silver fine china and people dressed like magazine ads. Every head turned as I stepped in. The noise dipped just for a breath before picking back up again with forced laughter. "Your father made it," someone said too loudly. Mark led me down a hallway to a small bathroom near the kitchen. The mirror above the sink showed exactly what Samantha saw, a man drenched from the snow, hair damp, jacket smudged, tie uneven. I washed my hands, scrubbing until the water turned gray, and used a towel to dry the oil from my skin. It didn't help much. When I came back out, Mark was waiting by the kitchen door. "Don't take it personally," he said quietly. "Samantha just gets anxious about appearances." I smiled faintly. "I know, son. She's not the first person who's been embarrassed to stand next to me." He looked down, guilty. "It's not like that." "It's exactly like that," I said gently. "But it's okay. I came here for dinner, not approval." Mark started to speak but stopped when his mother-in-law appeared. Patricia Benton was tall and perfectly composed, every movement rehearsed. "Henry," she said with a polished smile. "How lovely to see you again. You must be freezing." "I'm all right," I said. "Just glad to be here." "Of course," she replied, tone brittle. "Please make yourself comfortable. We're just about to sit down." Back in the dining room, the table stretched almost the length of the room, glowing under a massive crystal chandelier. There were at least a dozen guests, business partners, extended family people whose names I'd never remember. I took the empty seat at the far end near the sideboard, a good distance from the head, where Harold Benton sat like a judge in his own courtroom. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it got when I reached for my napkin. Someone whispered. Someone else coughed. Samantha filled her glass with wine and avoided looking at me. Harold cleared his throat. "Well, now that we're all here," he said, "let's give thanks." Everyone bowed their heads. I did too, though I wasn't sure who I was praying to anymore. When the prayer ended, the chatter returned light, effortless, the kind that comes from people who've never worried about paying bills. They talked about market trends, about skiing in Aspen, about the upcoming merger with some renewable energy firm. I kept quiet, content to listen. Halfway through dinner, Harold turned to me. "So, Henry," he said, voice smooth and loud enough for everyone to hear. "You were delayed by car trouble." "Not mine," I said. "I stopped to help someone stranded on the interstate." "Ah." He smiled thinly. "Still the Good Samaritan, I see. Most people would have just called a service and kept going." "Maybe," I said. "But I've always believed if you can help, you should." Patricia gave a polite laugh. "That's a lovely philosophy. Though I imagine it doesn't always make for clean clothes." A few people chuckled. My son stared down at his plate. I swallowed my pride and smiled. "No, ma'am, it doesn't." The server brought another bottle of wine, and conversation drifted away from me again. I could hear snippets, Harold bragging about Benton Construction's expansion, Samantha talking about charity galas, someone mentioning that Mr. Warren, the CEO they were hoping to partner with, might stop by later that evening. The name made me pause, but I said nothing. I looked around the table. The candles flickered in the reflection of crystal glassware. My pumpkin pie sat untouched near the dessert cart, its foil covering slightly bent. I'd placed it there earlier, thinking it might fit somewhere between the chocolate mousse and the imported pastries. Now, it looked out of place, like me. Samantha leaned toward Mark, whispering. Her voice carried just enough. "He really couldn't have changed before coming." Mark murmured something back, but I didn't hear the words. I stared at the silverware, the perfect folds of the napkins, the way people smiled at each other, with teeth, but not eyes. My throat felt tight. Harold looked at me again. "You know, Henry," he said casually, "I admire your hands-on attitude. It's refreshing. Not many people like getting dirty these days." "Some of us don't have much choice," I said softly. He chuckled, missing the point or ignoring it. Dinner went on, the laughter louder now, fueled by wine and confidence. I sat back and watched them, thinking how strange it was that a house full of people could feel lonelier than an empty apartment. When dessert time came, Patricia announced proudly, "We had the pastry chef from the Bellevue bake something special tonight." Samantha added, "And Dad, don't forget, Mr. Warren might arrive any minute." Mr. Warren. The name rang again in my mind. I reached into my pocket and brushed my fingers over the silver card I'd been given just hours earlier. Couldn't be, I thought. The world wasn't that small. As people began serving themselves slices of the fancy tart, Samantha walked by me and whispered, "Dad says if Mr. Warren comes, please don't mention the car thing. We'd rather keep tonight professional." I looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Don't worry, Samantha. I've learned when to stay quiet." She hesitated, unsure if that was agreement or reproach, then turned away. For the rest of dessert, I barely spoke. I watched the clock tick toward 7. My head buzzed faintly from the noise, the lights, the polite cruelty, hidden in laughter. Then, just as Harold raised his glass to make another toast, the doorbell rang. Patricia frowned. Who could that be? Everyone's here. The butler hurried out of the room. Through the quiet, I could hear faint voices in the hall, one confident familiar, the other deferential. Samantha smirked. Probably another late guest. How rude. I felt a strange pull in my chest, an instinct. A moment later, the butler's voice carried into the dining room. Mr. Ethan Warren has arrived. The room froze. Wine glasses halfway raised, forks in midair. I set mine down slowly. My heart thudded once hard. I hadn't expected to see that silver-haired man again so soon. And I definitely hadn't expected him to walk into this room, into this family's world, just as every eye turned toward him. The night, it seemed, was just getting started. The room went quiet the moment the butler said his name. Forks froze in midair, and even the fire seemed to dim. Then through the archway, Ethan Warren stepped in. He brushed the snow from his gray coat. His movements calm, unhurried, like a man who knew the world waited for him. The light from the chandelier caught the silver in his hair, and every whisper in the room turned into silence. Harold Benton was the first to recover. He stood, his voice loud, but slightly too cheerful. Mr. Warren, what an honor. We didn't expect you to brave the storm. Ethan smiled politely and shook his hand. Traffic was slow, but I couldn't miss a Benton Thanksgiving. I hear the food's always worth the trip. Laughter rippled around the table, nervous, eager. Samantha practically glowed as she stood up, smoothing her dress, her eyes wide. Mr. Warren, she said, I'm Samantha Mark's wife. We're so thrilled you could come. Likewise, Ethan said, nodding. His gaze swept the room with quiet precision, landing on each person just long enough to make them feel seen. Then his eyes stopped on me. For half a heartbeat, his expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable recognition. He didn't say anything, not yet. Just the faintest smile. Please, Harold said, gesturing grandly, join us. We saved you a seat near the head. Actually, Ethan said, scanning the table again, I'd prefer to sit over there. His eyes met mine once more. If that seat's free, of course. Every head turned toward me. Samantha's smile faltered. Harold blinked. You mean down there? That's right, Ethan said easily. I've had enough of sitting at the top of tables lately. He walked past them all, unbuttoned his coat, and took the seat beside me. The scrape of his chair against the floor sounded louder than anything else in the room. I stared at my plate. My heart thudded in my chest. The entire table was pretending not to look, but the air was thick with curiosity. Ethan leaned slightly toward me, lowering his voice just enough for me to hear. Good to see you again, Mr. Lawson. I turned to him, trying to keep my face neutral. Didn't expect to see you here, Mr. Warren. He smiled faintly. Life has a funny way of circling back, doesn't it? Samantha cleared her throat from the far end. Mr. Warren, we were just discussing your company's expansion. My father's been so eager to finalize the partnership. Ethan straightened, his tone still pleasant. Ah, yes. Benton Construction and Warren Industries, two fine names. I'm sure we'll find common ground. Harold laughed a little too loudly. Absolutely. We've been preparing for this collaboration for months. As they spoke, I noticed subtle things, the way Harold's hand shook slightly as he poured wine, the way Samantha's laugh sounded brittle, practiced. The other guests followed their lead, chiming in with flattery about Ethan's accomplishments, pretending not to be desperate for his approval. Ethan listened, polite and composed. But every few moments, he glanced my way, and I couldn't help but wonder what he was thinking. The conversation shifted to the economy, then philanthropy, then politics. I stayed quiet, letting the words wash over me. Eventually, Harold said, "Mr. Warren, I think you'll find our family very community-minded. My daughter runs several charities." Ethan smiled almost warmly. "Really, what kind?" Samantha leaned forward. "Oh, we host galas for children's hospitals, fundraisers for scholarships. It's all very fulfilling work." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "I'm sure it is. Though I've always found that helping people face to face leaves a longer mark than black tie dinners." The air tightened. Harold's fork paused mid-cut. Samantha forced a laugh. "Of course, but it's important to show effort. The public likes to see people giving back." "Some people give quietly," Ethan said, still smiling. "Those are the ones I tend to remember." I didn't say a word, but my hands felt suddenly warm. Dinner carried on, each course more awkward than the last. I tried to stay invisible, but it was impossible with Ethan sitting beside me. Guests leaned forward, trying to piece together who I was and why a billionaire had chosen the seat next to the old mechanic at the end of the table. At one point, a younger man across from us whispered, "So, Henry, what do you do?" Before I could answer, Samantha cut in. "He's retired now. Used to work with engines, right, Henry?" Ethan turned to me. "That's right, isn't it? Engineering?" "Yeah," I said quietly. 40 years in mechanical design." He nodded. "Explains a lot." Samantha blinked. "Explains?" "What?" Ethan swirled his wine. "Why my car started tonight." Her smile froze. "Your car?" Ethan leaned back in his chair. "Yes. I broke down on the interstate about an hour before I got here. Snow, wind, the works. This man pulled over, fixed my car with nothing but a bottle of Coca-Cola and a car key. Saved me a long wait." The room fell silent again. Harold let out a strained laugh. "You're joking." "I never joke about good fortune," Ethan said lightly. "He got me here." All eyes turned toward me. I tried to shrink into my seat. "Just did what anyone would do," I murmured. Ethan shook his head. "No, most people wouldn't have stopped. I can count on one hand the number of people who would." Patricia smiled uneasily. "Well, isn't that wonderful? How lucky for everyone." Ethan's gaze sharpened. Luck had nothing to do with it. Character did. Samantha's cheeks flushed. "That's really kind of you to say." He looked directly at her. "Kindness isn't a favor. It's a reflection." Mark shifted in his seat. I saw something flicker across his face. Pride maybe mixed with shame. Harold cleared his throat, trying to steer the mood. "Well, Mr. Warren, I'm sure this won't affect our business discussion, but that's quite a story. You two meeting by chance like that." Ethan's smile returned slow and deliberate. "I don't believe in chance, Mr. Benton. Only timing. And tonight seems like good timing to talk about values." The guests glanced at each other, unsure whether to laugh or stay quiet. Harold chuckled awkwardly. "Of course. Values, yes." Ethan raised his glass. "To the people who remind us of them." He glanced at me again before taking a sip. As the conversation resumed, I could feel the energy in the room shifting. People who had barely noticed me now offered polite smiles. Someone asked about my old work. Another guest said, "That's impressive, fixing a luxury engine in this weather." I just nodded, too tired to play along. Across the table, Samantha looked pale, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. Harold was watching Ethan carefully, his confident smile starting to strain. For the rest of the meal, Ethan remained gracious but firm, weaving every topic back to integrity and gratitude, subtly dismantling the Benton family's facade without ever raising his voice. By dessert, the tension was so thick you could have sliced it with a butter knife. When the butler served coffee, Ethan turned to me again. "Mr. Lawson, I'm in your debt." I shook my head. "No debt. You'd have done the same. He smiled. Maybe. But I'm not sure I would have done it as gracefully. Samantha finally spoke, voice small. It's getting late, perhaps we should... Ethan interrupted gently. Patience, Mrs. Benton. Sometimes the most important parts of the evening happen last. He looked around the room, his tone still pleasant, but his eyes sharp. I think it's time we all talked about what really makes a family worth admiring. The only sound was the crackling of the fire. Harold leaned back in his chair, forcing a laugh. Well, I suppose we're about to find out, Ethan smiled. Yes, he said softly. I believe we are. And that was how the night shifted again just before everything truly turned upside down. Ethan stood near the end of the table, his presence commanding without him raising his voice. Every eye followed him as he set his glass down, the faint clink echoing in the silence. He had that kind of power, quiet, deliberate, the kind that made even confident people second-guess themselves. I think he said before we discuss business, we should talk about character. The words hung in the air. Harold Benton's smile tightened. Of course, he said quickly, we're very proud of our family's values. Ethan glanced at me, then back at him. I'm sure you are. But sometimes values are best seen in action, not in speeches. Samantha laughed softly, the kind of laugh that's meant to fill awkward space. Well, I'm sure we could all agree with that. I'm not so sure everyone does, Ethan replied calmly. His tone wasn't sharp, but it cut just the same. The air thickened again. Harold cleared his throat. Mr. Warren, why don't we? Ethan raised a hand. Let me finish. You see, an hour before I arrived here, I was stranded in a snowstorm. My car died on the highway. Do you know who stopped to help me? He turned toward me, his voice steady. That man. Henry Lawson. Every head turned. I felt my ears burn and I stared down at my plate. He could have kept driving. Ethan continued like everyone else. Instead, he got out of his warm truck, ruined his clothes, and fixed my car with a bottle of Coca-Cola. No payment, no hesitation, just kindness. A murmur ran through the room. Someone whispered, "With Coke." Ethan smiled slightly. Yes. Ingenious, isn't it? But more than that, it reminded me what real integrity looks like. Simple, quiet, unselfish. Harold tried to laugh it off. That's very fortunate. We're glad he was there for you. Fortunate, Ethan said softly, tilting his head. I'd call it something else. Remarkable. Samantha's face flushed pink. Well, Henry's always been very hands-on. He loves helping people. Ethan's eyes met hers. Then perhaps we should all be a bit more hands-on. No one spoke. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the soft clink of a fork against porcelain. Ethan leaned back in his chair, still composed. You know, people like to talk about leadership, about running companies, managing teams, expanding markets. But real leadership starts with compassion, doing the right thing when no one's watching. Patricia gave a small, tight smile. That's a beautiful sentiment, Mr. Warren. He nodded once. It's not sentiment. It's survival. Empathy keeps a community alive long after money runs out. Mark looked up from his plate, meeting my eyes for the first time all evening. I saw pride flicker there, hesitant, uncertain, but real. It almost undid me. Harold shifted in his chair, his face turning red. Mr. Warren, I assure you, our family values integrity as much as anyone. Ethan's smile didn't waver. I'm sure you do, Mr. Benton. Though I find it curious that when I entered this room, the man who helped me was sitting at the farthest end of the table. A sharp silence followed. I could feel Samantha's glare, the weight of embarrassment crawling up the back of my neck. Ethan continued, his tone even. If that's how you treat people who demonstrate character, then perhaps your company's definition of value needs adjusting. Harold forced a laugh. Surely you're not suggesting. I'm suggesting, Ethan said, voice dropping, that wealth and decency aren't always found in the same room. The words landed like stones. Nobody moved. Finally, I spoke. Mr. Warren, please, you don't have to. He looked at me, and for the first time that night, his voice softened. I know I don't have to, but sometimes the truth deserves to be said aloud. He turned back to the table. Henry reminded me of something I'd forgotten. That success doesn't mean much if you've lost sight of what matters. When I was younger, I learned that lesson the hard way. Tonight, he taught it to me again. Patricia reached for her glass, her hands trembling slightly. You're very kind to say that. I'm not being kind, Ethan replied. I'm being honest. He raised his glass, looking down the table toward me. To Henry Lawson, a man who still believes in doing the right thing even when no one notices. I wanted to disappear. But as everyone hesitated, Ethan's gaze moved deliberately around the room, until one by one they lifted their glasses too. To Henry, Mark said quietly. To Henry, a few others echoed. The words didn't feel mocking. They felt genuine. I swallowed hard, nodding in thanks, not trusting myself to speak. After the toast, the conversations grew softer, less rehearsed. People actually talked to me. A woman across the table asked about my old engineering work. Someone else wanted to know if the Coke trick really worked. I answered modestly, still unsure how to handle the sudden shift. Samantha barely spoke. She smiled at Ethan when he looked her way, but otherwise kept her eyes on her plate. Harold's charm was gone. He looked like a man who'd been caught bluffing a game he thought he'd already won. Ethan, on the other hand, looked completely at ease. He asked questions about people's lives, joked lightly, steered the mood back from awkwardness to reflection. And yet every so often he'd glance at me, almost studying me as though measuring something invisible. As dessert plates were cleared, Ethan turned to me again. Mr. Lawson, he said, I'd like to see you again sometime, under warmer circumstances, I hope. I smiled. That'd be nice, though I'm not sure I have much to offer a man like you. He shook his head. You already did. Before I could respond, Harold rose from his seat, trying to reclaim control. Well, he said, clearing his throat, this has been quite an evening. We're so glad you could join us, Mr. Warren. Ethan stood too, buttoning his coat. The pleasure was mine. He paused, looking directly at Harold. You've built an impressive business. But remember, partnerships are built on trust, not appearances. Harold forced a smile, his voice tight. Of course. Ethan's gaze lingered for a moment, then he turned toward me. Henry, I'll be in touch. And just like that, he left the room. The front door closed softly behind him, leaving behind a silence thicker than before. When I finally looked up, Samantha was staring at me, her face pale. That man. He's the Ethan Warren, Mark answered before I could. Yeah, the one Dad helped on the road. No one spoke after that. I finished the last of my coffee, set the cup down, and stood. Thank you for dinner, I said quietly. Samantha didn't reply. Harold gave a stiff nod. As I walked toward the door, Mark caught up to me. Dad, he whispered. I didn't know. I didn't realize. I smiled, putting a hand on his shoulder. It's all right, son. Some lessons don't come easy. Outside, the snow had started again, soft flakes drifting through the glow of the porch lights. I walked to my truck, feeling the cold bite my skin, but inside I felt something warm. For the first time in a long time, I hadn't needed to fight for respect. It had found me on its own. Behind me, through the frosted window, I could see them still sitting in stunned silence, their perfect dinner turned inside out by a stranger and a bottle of Coke. And as I started the engine, I couldn't help but smile. The night had changed everything, and somehow, I knew it wasn't over yet. The morning after the dinner, I woke up still hearing Ethan Warren's voice in my head. Partnerships are built on trust, not appearances. It echoed between my ears like an old song I couldn't stop humming. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat by the window. Snow still blanketed the streets, sparkling under the cold Oregon sun. Everything outside was calm, but inside I could still feel the electricity from the night before. I didn't expect to hear from him again. Billionaires don't call men like me twice. But around 9 a.m., my phone rang, and there it was, a number I didn't recognize, crisp and direct. "Mr. Lawson," the voice said. "Speaking. This is Ethan Warren. I hope I'm not calling too early. I almost spilled my coffee." No. I was just surprised." He chuckled. "You and I have unfinished business. I'd like to talk further privately. Are you free for lunch?" "Lunch," I repeated. "Yes. I'll send a driver. Say noon." There wasn't much to think about. "All right," I said. "Good. I'll see you soon, Henry." He hung up before I could ask where. I sat there a long minute, staring at my reflection in the dark coffee, half convinced I was dreaming. The car came exactly at noon, a black town car, sleek and spotless, the kind of thing that didn't belong in my neighborhood. The driver didn't speak much, just smiled politely as I climbed in. We drove through the icy streets until we reached a quiet restaurant near the waterfront, the kind of place that didn't post prices on the menu. Ethan was already there, sitting by the window, reading something on his phone. He stood when he saw me, smiling like we were old friends. "Mr. Lawson," he said, shaking my hand. "I'm glad you came. I figured you don't invite people like me twice," I said. He laughed. "You'd be surprised how few people I actually want to talk to." We sat down, and a waiter appeared instantly, offering coffee. Ethan waved him off with a smile. "Let's skip the formalities. I wanted to apologize for last night." "Apologize?" I asked, confused. He leaned forward. "I didn't mean to embarrass you. I know that room was full of people who didn't deserve your kindness. But sometimes the truth needs witnesses." I shook my head. "You didn't embarrass me, Mr. Warren. You embarrassed them." He smiled faintly. "That wasn't my intention, but I can't say I regret it." We talked for a while about the weather, about cars, even about his company. But eventually he got quiet and said, "Henry, there's something about you that reminds me of the man I used to be before all this." All what I asked. He looked out the window. Money, power, people pretending to care. You start thinking kindness is weakness. Then someone like you stops on a frozen highway and fixes your car, and you realize you've been measuring the wrong things. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. "Tell me," he continued. "What did you do before you retired?" "I was an engineer," I said. "Built fuel systems for 30 years, worked my way up from the floor." "Nothing fancy." He smiled. "That's more impressive than most people at that dinner table last night. They inherit everything. You built yours?" "Maybe," I said quietly. "But building doesn't mean much if no one remembers what you built." Ethan studied me for a long moment. "You know, that's exactly why I wanted to see you." Before I could ask what he meant, a waiter came by with lunch. Ethan waited until the man left before continuing. "I've been looking for someone to help me with something," he said. "A project I've been developing through my foundation. We're building community programs, job training, mentorship, small workshops for people starting over. I need someone who understands real work, real people. Someone who's not afraid to get their hands dirty." "You've got hundreds of people for that," I said. He shook his head. "I've got executives who can run numbers. I need a man who can fix a broken engine and maybe fix a few people while he's at it." I stared at him, unsure if he was serious. "You're offering me a job? I'm offering you a purpose," he said simply. "Title Head of Community Engagement for the Warren Foundation. You'd oversee programs, advise us on development, meet people where they are. I'm retired, Mr. Warren. So was I once. Then I realized retirement's just another word for waiting. I couldn't help laughing. I don't have a degree in social work. I'm just a mechanic with opinions. Exactly, he said. That's what makes you perfect for it. You know what dignity looks like because you've lived without it in rooms like last night's. I sat there in silence trying to process it. Me, working for a billionaire foundation? It sounded like a bad joke. Finally, I said, "Why me?" He smiled that same quiet, deliberate smile. "Because when I met you, you reminded me of my father. He worked in a factory all his life. Didn't have money, but he had something most men spend fortunes trying to buy, self-respect. You have that too." My throat tightened. That's a hell of a compliment. He nodded. "It's also a request. Think about it. We'd start with 6 months trial run. 75,000 full benefits travel if you want it. And I'll tell you this isn't charity. You'd be earning every penny." I looked at my hands, calloused and old, resting on the white tablecloth. They looked out of place here. But for the first time in years, I felt like maybe they still had a job left in them. "I'll think about it," I said, finally. Ethan grinned. "Good. Don't take too long. I'm not patient with smart people who hesitate." We finished lunch talking about simpler things, cars, family, the storm. When it was time to leave, he shook my hand again. His grip was firm, steady, like a man sealing a promise. On the ride home, I stared out the window, watching the city roll by. I thought about Mark and how proud he'd be, or maybe how confused. I thought about Samantha, probably still pretending nothing had happened. And I thought about Ethan, a man who'd built an empire only to realize it wasn't enough. When the driver dropped me off, I sat in my truck for a long time before going inside. The house felt different, smaller, but somehow warmer. On the counter sat the silver business card from 2 nights ago. I picked it up, tracing the letters with my thumb. Ethan Warren, Warren Foundation. For a long time, I'd believed that men like him lived in a different universe from men like me. But maybe the line between us wasn't as thick as I thought. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, listening to the wind outside, thinking about Linda, about the people who'd looked down on me, about the road that had led me here. By dawn, I'd made up my mind. I might have been late to that dinner, but maybe, just maybe, I was right on time for the rest of my life. When I pulled into the Warren Foundation's parking lot for the first time, I sat in the truck a few minutes longer than I should have. The building was all glass and steel, shining in the morning sun, like something from another world. I'd spent my life walking through oil-stained garages and cracked concrete floors, not lobbies with marble walls and fresh-cut flowers. I almost turned around and drove home. Then I remembered what Linda used to say whenever I doubted myself. "You don't belong where you're comfortable, Henry. You belong where you can make a difference." So I killed the engine, grabbed my coat, and walked inside. The receptionist smiled when I gave her my name. "Mr. Warren's expecting you, top floor." Her tone was respectful, not the kind of polite distance I'd grown used to from people like Samantha or Harold. Genuine. It caught me off guard. The elevator ride was quiet except for the hum of machinery. My reflection in the glass looked smaller than I felt, but steadier too. When the doors opened, Ethan was already standing there, waiting with a cup of coffee in hand. "Henry," he said warmly, "glad you made it. Come on in." His office overlooked the river. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a perfect view of the city's sunlight glinting off the water. But the space didn't feel cold or corporate. There were photos on the walls, black and white images of construction sites, steelworkers, community centers. Real people. Real work. Ethan motioned for me to sit. "You ever been here before?" I shook my head. "Can't say I get invited to buildings like this often." He smiled. "Neither do I, if I can help it." He handed me a folder. "Before we talk about the job, I want you to see something." Inside were old newspaper clippings, some yellowed, some torn. Headlines from 20 years ago: local workshop trains disadvantaged youths for mechanical careers. There was a photo, too, of a younger me and Linda standing in front of the small vocational center we'd run on weekends. My throat tightened. "Where'd you get these?" Ethan leaned back in his chair. "I was one of those kids, Henry." I looked up, unsure I'd heard right. "You what?" He nodded. 16 years old. No father. My mom worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table. That workshop you and your wife started, it changed my life. I stared at him, trying to find the boy in the man, across from me. "You're saying you went through that program I did? You taught me how to rebuild an engine block." He smiled a little wistfully. "You probably don't remember." I was quiet, awkward. Couldn't even tell a wrench from a socket. "You stayed late one night helping me fix an old carburetor, remember? You told me it didn't matter how poor I was if I learned how to solve problems." I tried to speak, but couldn't. The memory came rushing back in fragments: the smell of oil, the sound of rain against the tin roof, the skinny kid with serious eyes asking questions long after everyone else had gone home. "I had no idea," I said finally. Ethan nodded. "That's the point. You didn't do it for recognition. You did it because it was right." He got up, walked to the window, and looked out at the skyline. That night I decided I wasn't going to let circumstance define me. I went to college on a scholarship, started fixing old generators, built my first company at 27. Every success I've had since started in that garage with you. I sat there stunned, my hands gripping the folder. "Why didn't you say something before?" He turned and smiled. "I wanted to see if you'd remember me without the title." I laughed quietly. "You've changed a bit." "So have you," he said gently. "But I knew it was you the moment you poured Coke on my battery. Same calm, same hands, same patience." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The years between us, decades of work loss, and life felt like they'd folded into a single moment. Ethan sat back down. "When I saw you that night, I realized something. I'd spent years building companies and partnerships, but I'd forgotten why I started in the first place. You reminded me that people like you are the foundation this country's built on. You fixed my car, Henry. But more than that, you fixed my perspective." I exhaled slowly. "I just did what anyone would have done." He shook his head. "No, that's the thing. Most people wouldn't. You helped a stranger with nothing to gain, and that's why I want you to help me build this next chapter." He handed me another folder. Inside were plans, blueprints, project outlines, budgets. The title at the top read, "Community Restoration Initiative." "You'd lead this," Ethan said. "Partner with local workshops, train unemployed workers, rebuild the spirit of small towns that big corporations forgot. It's not just charity, it's rebuilding dignity." I flipped through the pages. My pulse quickened. "You're serious about this?" "Completely. I want someone who's lived it to run it." The weight of his words settled over me. I thought about all the years since Linda died, the empty apartment, the routine that kept me from feeling too much. Maybe this was what she'd meant when she told me to keep doing good, even when no one was watching. "I don't know what to say," I admitted. "Say yes?" Ethan said, smiling. "And if you don't, I'll just keep asking until you do." I laughed, shaking my head. "You don't give up easy, do you?" "Neither did you," he said. "That's how I learned. For a long time, I just sat there looking out the window at the city, my reflection blending with his. 2 men from different worlds, tied together by one forgotten act of kindness." Finally, I said, "All right, I'll do it." Ethan stood and extended his hand. "Welcome aboard, Henry." His handshake was firm, but what I felt wasn't business. It was gratitude. As I left his office, I looked again at that old photo on the wall. Linda's smile beamed back at me through time, proud and warm. In the elevator down, I couldn't stop smiling. Funny how life works. You spend decades thinking your best days are behind you, and then one conversation brings it all rushing back. When I stepped outside, the air was crisp and bright. The river shimmered under the afternoon light. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like a man out of place. I felt like a man finally standing where he was meant to be. I took Ethan's business card out of my pocket and flipped it over. In small handwriting on the back, he'd written one line, full circle. And he was right. It really was. The day after meeting Ethan, I woke up earlier than usual. The apartment was cold, but my chest felt warm in a way I hadn't felt for years. The morning light poured through the blinds, hitting the photo of Linda on the nightstand. I touched the edge of the frame and whispered, "You'd probably tell me not to screw this up." I spent half the morning trying to decide what to wear. Nothing in my closet screamed executive material. But then again, Ethan wasn't hiring me for my wardrobe. I picked the cleanest shirt I owned, pressed it as best I could, and drove to the Benton house. The invitation hadn't come from Ethan. It came from Mark. He'd called the night before, his voice uncertain. "Dad, Mr. Warren wants to meet with us again, at the house. Says it's important." I didn't ask questions. I could tell from his tone that he didn't understand what was happening yet. When I arrived, the Benton mansion looked the same as before, perfect, polished, and cold. But inside, something had shifted. The laughter was gone. The staff spoke in whispers. Harold stood near the fireplace, his usual confidence replaced by something that looked like worry. Ethan was already there, calm as ever, sitting in one of the armchairs by the fire. He rose when I walked in. "Henry," he said warmly, "thank you for coming." "Didn't think I had a choice," I joked, trying to ease the tension. He smiled. "You always have a choice. You just make the right ones." Harold cleared his throat. "So, Mr. Warren, to what do we owe this visit?" Ethan gestured toward the fire. "I wanted to continue our conversation from the other night. About values, about partnerships." Harold forced a laugh. "Ah, yes. Well, of course. Our companies share plenty of common ground." "Do we?" Ethan said quietly. "Because after last night, I'm not sure we share much at all." Samantha appeared at the top of the stairs, dressed impeccably as always. "Mr. Warren, what exactly is this about?" "It's about honesty," Ethan said simply, "and about how we treat people when no one's watching." I shifted uncomfortably, sensing where this was going. Ethan turned toward Harold. "I came to offer you a partnership. But before I could finalize it, I needed to know who I was working with. And what I saw told me everything." Harold's face darkened. "Are you accusing my family of something?" Ethan shook his head. "No. I'm reminding you of something. That every fortune starts with someone who worked hard, someone who got their hands dirty. You've forgotten that." Patricia entered from the dining room, pale but composed. "Mr. Warren, we've always prided ourselves on our ethics." "I'm sure you have," Ethan replied, "but pride isn't the same as character." The room went still. Mark stood by the window, silent, watching it unfold. I could see the discomfort in his face, caught between the family he was born into and the one he'd married into. Ethan turned to me. "Henry, would you mind telling them what happened on the highway?" I hesitated. "There's not much to tell." "Tell it anyway," he said gently. I looked around the room, Samantha's arms crossed. Harold frowning, Patricia clutching her necklace. I saw a man stranded in the snow. I began. Didn't know who he was. Didn't care. Figured I could help, so I did. That's all. "Exactly," Ethan said. "He helped because he could not, because it benefited him." That's leadership, Mr. Benton. That's integrity. Harold let out a humorless laugh. You're making a saint out of a mechanic. Ethan's voice didn't rise, but it carried weight. I'm recognizing a man who has more class than anyone else in this room. The words hit harder than a shout. Samantha's mouth fell open slightly. Patricia turned away, and Harold froze. Mark stepped forward. "Dad," he said softly. "I think what he's saying is," Ethan interrupted. "What I'm saying is this: partnerships only work when they're built on respect. You can't run a company, a family, or a life without it." Harold's voice wavered. "Are you canceling our deal?" Ethan nodded once. "For now. Warren Industries won't be moving forward with Benton Construction until I see evidence of the values I was promised." The silence that followed was heavy. Samantha looked like she wanted to speak but didn't know where to start. Patricia stared into the fire. Ethan turned to me again. "Henry, I know this is uncomfortable, but I wanted them to hear it with you here, because it concerns you too." I frowned. "Me?" "Yes," he said. "I meant what I offered at lunch. The position at the foundation, it's yours if you want it. Head of Community Engagement. Full salary 6-month trial. You'd report directly to me. You could have heard a pin drop." Samantha blinked. "You're offering him a job?" Ethan nodded calmly. "I'm offering the most qualified man I know a job." Harold stepped forward, his voice sharp. "This is ridiculous." "He doesn't have experience." Ethan cut him off. "He has what your company's missing: heart. You can teach strategy. You can't teach decency." I stared at Ethan, still trying to process it. "I appreciate it, Mr. Warren, but I'm not sure I fit in with your kind of people." He smiled. "You don't have to fit in, Henry. You just have to be exactly who you are." I looked at Mark, who was watching me with wide eyes. "Dad," he said, his voice quiet but full of pride, "you should do it." Samantha didn't say anything. She just sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Harold exhaled slowly, defeated. "Well," he said bitterly, "I suppose that's settled then." "Not quite," Ethan said. He faced Harold and added, "You can still be part of this if you're willing to listen and learn. The foundation will be launching new community programs. If your company wants to rebuild its reputation, we can work together." But this time, Henry calls the shots. My eyes widened. "Me?" Ethan nodded. "You'll oversee local initiatives, including partnerships. Think of it as quality control for integrity." I couldn't help laughing. "That's a tall order." "You're a tall man when it counts," he said. The fire cracked, filling the room with warmth that finally felt real. Harold looked at me, then at Ethan, and for once he didn't have anything to say. I took a breath. "If I'm doing this," I said, "I want to do it right. And I want to start here." "Here?" Ethan asked. I nodded. "This family. This company. Let's rebuild something better, something real." Ethan smiled, his eyes lighting up. "That's the spirit." He extended his hand, and I shook it. His grip was steady grounding. Mark smiled through tears he tried to hide. "Dad," he whispered, "Mom would have loved this." "Yeah," I said softly. "She would have." Ethan glanced at the clock. "Then it's settled. Welcome aboard, Henry." As he prepared to leave, he paused by Harold's desk. "One last thing, Mr. Benton. Be careful who you underestimate. Sometimes the man you look down on is the one holding you up." He walked out the door, leaving the room stunned and silent. I looked at the fire, at the reflection of my hands, old scarred, still steady. For the first time in years, I felt useful again. When I stepped outside, snow had started falling softly, the world quiet and new. Maybe it wasn't revenge. Maybe it was redemption, the kind that didn't need applause. Just a second chance to do something that mattered. The house was quiet the next morning. Too quiet. The kind of silence that follows a storm when everyone's afraid to move. I sat in my truck at the end of the Benton driveway, watching the frost melt on the windshield. Part of me wanted to drive off and never come back, but another part, the same stubborn part that used to make me fix broken engines no one thought could run again, told me this family still had a chance. Maybe not to change the past, but at least to start over. When I finally stepped inside, the air felt heavy. Harold was sitting alone in his study, a cup of coffee untouched on his desk. The usual confidence on his face had been replaced by something quieter, almost human. He looked up when he saw me, but didn't stand. "Henry," he said, voice rough, "didn't expect you to come back here." "I didn't expect to either," I said. "But I figured running away never fixed much." He gave a small, humorless laugh. "You sound like my father. I'll take that as a compliment." He leaned back in his chair, staring at the fireplace. "Warren canceled our deal," he said. "You know that, right? He postponed it," I corrected. "Said you still had a chance to make things right." Harold's jaw tightened. "Maybe I don't deserve the chance." "Maybe not," I said. "But your son and daughter-in-law do. So do your employees. This isn't about you anymore." He looked up, studying me for a long time. Then he nodded slowly, like something inside him had finally cracked open. "You really believe a man can start over?" "I have to," I said. "Otherwise, none of this means anything." He let out a long breath. "Ethan said you'd be leading some sort of initiative. The foundation project." "That's right," I said. "We're starting with job training mentorship programs. Places that remind people their worth doesn't come from money." He smiled faintly. "You're talking like a preacher. More like a mechanic who's seen too many broken people left on the side of the road." He nodded, eyes distant. "If you ever need resources, Benton Construction can help." I can't undo what I said or didn't say, but maybe I can build something better. "That's a start," I said. When I left the study, I found Mark in the hallway, pacing with his hands in his pockets. He looked younger, somehow lighter. "Dad," he said, meeting my eyes. "I don't know how to thank you. For what? For not walking out last night, for being better than all of us." I chuckled. "Don't give me too much credit, son. I almost did walk out." He smiled sheepishly. "Samantha hasn't stopped crying since Ethan left." "She's in the kitchen." I raised an eyebrow. "Crying?" He nodded. "She's realizing what she did." I hesitated before walking toward the kitchen. Samantha was sitting at the table, hands around a mug of tea gone cold. Her eyes were red mascara smudged. For once, she looked less like a magazine cover and more like a person. She stood when she saw me. "Mr. Lawson," she began, her voice shaky. "I don't even know where to start." "You can start by sitting down," I said gently. She did. "I was awful to you," she said after a moment. "I thought I was protecting our image. I didn't realize I was destroying something much more important." I nodded slowly. "I know what it's like to want approval. I spent years chasing it myself. But the truth is, people's opinions change faster than the weather. Integrity doesn't." She wiped her eyes. "Mark told me what Mr. Warren said. About the new programs, about you leading them." "Yeah," I said. Still trying to wrap my head around it, she smiled faintly. "You'll be good at it." "You already are." "Maybe," I said. "But I'll need help. People who understand the power of second chances." Her eyes met mine. "You're offering me one?" I shrugged. "Everyone deserves one. Even those who don't think they do." She covered her mouth, trying not to cry again. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Truly." I reached across the table, patting her hand. Apology accepted. When Mark came back into the room, the tension had finally lifted. He looked from her to me, relief written all over his face. "You two talking again?" "We're getting there," I said. He smiled. That's more than I hoped for. Later that afternoon, I drove home. The snow had melted into gray puddles, and the roads were slick with light rain. The world looked cleaner somehow, like the storm had washed away more than just dirt. When I reached my apartment, I sat at the kitchen table and opened my notebook. At the top of a blank page, I wrote Community Restoration Initiative, Phase 1. Underneath, I listed names, old friends, mechanics, teachers, people who'd been left behind. People who still had something to give. I worked until the sun went down, planning the kind of project Linda and I used to dream about. For the first time in years, I didn't feel old. I felt alive. A knock came at the door just as I was putting my pen down. When I opened it, I found Harold standing there holding an envelope. He looked uncomfortable, like a man who wasn't used to apologizing. "I didn't come to bother you," he said quickly. "I just wanted to drop this off." "What is it?" He handed me the envelope. Inside was a check made out to Warren Foundation. Lawson Initiative. I blinked. "This is a lot of money, Harold." He nodded. "Call it an investment, or penance. Whatever you like, just use it right." "I will," I said. He smiled faintly. "Good. Maybe next Thanksgiving we'll have something worth celebrating." After he left, I sat there holding the check, the paper warm from his hands. Maybe people really could change. The next week moved fast. Meetings with Ethan's team, calls from local organizations, messages from volunteers. It felt like being thrown back into the world again, but in the best way possible. One night as I was finishing up paperwork, Mark stopped by my apartment. He brought pizza and 2 cold beers. We ate at the table like we used to when he was a kid, helping me in the garage. "Dad," he said after a few bites, "I'm proud of you." I laughed. "Took you long enough." He grinned. "Better late than never." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the rain streak down the window. "You know," I said, "sometimes revenge doesn't look like getting even. Sometimes it looks like turning pain into purpose." Mark nodded. "And you did that." I looked at him, realizing I wasn't angry anymore. Not at him, not at Samantha, not at anyone. The storm had passed. Before he left, he hugged me for the first time in years. "See you at the next family dinner," he said. "I'll bring the pie," I replied. When the door closed behind him, I looked around my small apartment and felt something settle in my chest. Peace. Real, quiet peace. The world outside still dripped with rain, but for the first time it didn't feel cold. Maybe redemption wasn't about changing who you were. Maybe it was about remembering who you'd been all along. Snow was falling again outside my window, soft and slow, like the world had finally decided to quiet down. The lights from the city shimmered on the wet streets, and the hum of cars far below sounded distant, almost peaceful. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and my notebook, the same one I'd used to sketch out the first ideas for the program. Now it was filled with names, stories, and plans, each one proof that what we started was actually working. It had been 6 months since the night at the Benton house, but sometimes it felt like 6 years. So much had changed, and yet the things that mattered hadn't. Mark called more often now. Samantha did too. She even volunteered at one of the community workshops, teaching resume skills to young women trying to get back on their feet. Harold's company had signed on as a sponsor for the Foundation's training initiative, and last week he'd shown up at one of the centers himself. He'd stood awkwardly, at first surrounded by people in work boots and stained shirts, until a teenage girl handed him a wrench and said, "You can help tighten that bolt." The way he smiled afterward told me maybe redemption was contagious. Ethan called every few days, though, not to check on progress. He said he trusted me for that. He called to talk about ideas, the kind that could change more lives. "You've turned this thing into something real," Henry, he said during one of our conversations. "You built more than a program, you built a bridge." I told him I just followed the blueprint he'd given me. He laughed. No, he said you drew the blueprint I didn't know I needed. Now, as I sat by the window flipping through pages of handwritten notes, I realized how right he was. The best things in life aren't built from money. They're built from the moments when you stop to help someone and don't think twice about it. I poured myself another cup of coffee and smiled. The photo of Linda sat beside my notebook. She looked just as she always had, strong, kind. The corners of her mouth curved into that patient smile I'd fallen for 40 years ago. I could almost hear her voice teasing me. Told you good things come when you least expect them. You were right again, I said quietly. That afternoon, I drove out to one of the community workshops in Portland. The building used to be an abandoned warehouse. Now it was alive with noise and purpose. Sparks flew from welding machines. Laughter echoed across the room, and the smell of oil mixed with coffee and hope. A sign on the wall read Lawson Initiative, Building Skills, Rebuilding Lives. As I walked in, people waved and nodded. Morning, Mr. Vera Lawson, someone called. We finished the first batch of toolkits. That's great, I said, smiling. Let's make sure we get them to the veterans shelter by Friday. In one corner, Samantha stood with a group of volunteers, showing them how to organize materials. She looked up and caught my eye. Hey, she said, walking over. We're ahead of schedule. You sound surprised, I teased. She laughed. I still am. Every day, you're doing good work, Samantha. Her eyes softened. You taught me what that means. Thank you for giving me the chance to fix what I broke. I shook my head. You didn't break anything that couldn't be repaired. We both smiled, and for the first time, the air between us felt light. Later, when the day wound down, I stepped outside. The sky was dimming, and snowflakes drifted lazily through the air. The world felt clean, as if life itself had taken a deep breath. I leaned against the railing, watching the city lights flicker to life one by one. Mark pulled up a few minutes later. Figured you'd still be here, he said, climbing out of his car with 2 steaming cups of coffee. Mom always said you don't leave until the job's done. She wasn't wrong, I said, taking one of the cups. He stood next to me, sipping his coffee in silence. You know, he said finally, I used to think success was about how high you could climb. Turns out it's about who you lift up along the way. I nodded. Your mother would have liked that one. He smiled. You think she'd be proud of us? I looked at the glowing sign above the door, the one with our family name on it, and then at my son standing beside me. Yeah, I said softly, I think she already is. We stood there for a long time, watching the snow fall. When I got home that night, I sat down with my notebook again. I wanted to write something to close this chapter of my life, though I knew the story wasn't over. I flipped to the last page and wrote, Kindness doesn't vanish. It waits for its turn to come back around. Then under it, I added, Sometimes the people you stop to help on the road end up helping you find your way home. I closed the notebook and turned off the lamp. The city outside glowed like 1,000 small stars scattered across the ground. If you're still watching this, maybe you've had a night like mine, a night when you were reminded that being kind doesn't make you weak. It makes you stronger than the people who confuse cruelty for power. Maybe you've been looked down on, ignored, or treated like you don't belong. I've been there. But here's the truth, you do belong. You always did. So, if you ever see someone stranded, stop to help. If you have the chance to make a difference, take it. And if life ever knocks you down hard, remember, it might just be setting you up to stand taller than before. Thanks for listening to my story. And if you've got one of your own, share it in the comments. I'd love to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe, because every story, no matter how ordinary it seems, might just be the one that changes someone else's life. Outside, the wind picked up, and the snow began to fall heavier, covering the street in white. I watched it through the window the same way Linda used to. Some Thanksgiving dinners change your evening. This one changed my entire future. And in the quiet glow of that winter night, I whispered, "Thank you to no one in particular, and to everyone who'd ever stopped to help."